I'm Garrett Wishon from Sam Houston Electric in Livingston, Texas. Welcome to Along Those Lines.
Building America's broadband network requires smart, scalable solutions. AFL's suite of Apex Splice closures streamlines deployment, saving time, maximizing space, and improving organization. Learn more at aflglobal.com/apex.
Hi, everyone. This is a podcast about electric cooperatives, the work they do, and the challenges they face. I'm your host, Molly Christian. Planned data center construction is surging to meet demand for cloud applications, cryptocurrency, streaming services, and artificial intelligence. Electric co ops are at the center of that development, with some fielding multiple new requests at a time to serve data centers.
For a few months, we were getting 10 requests a week, anywhere from 50 megawatts to 1 gigawatt. At one point last year, we had 4,000 megawatts in requests. And to put that in perspective, we're currently a 3,000 megawatt generation and transmission co-op.
These large loads can benefit co-ops in the communities they serve in a number of ways, but they can also pose a host of challenges. NRECA explored this trend in the December issue of RE Magazine. That exploration continues with this episode of Along Those Lines. First, we discuss data center risks and opportunities with Allison Hamilton, Markets and Rates Director for NRECA. Then we'll hear from two G&T leaders getting massive interest from data centers, Wabash Valley Power Alliance President and CEO Jeff Conrad, and JD Lowery, Director of Community and Economic Development for Arkansas Electric Cooperative Corporation. Welcome to the podcast, Allison.
Hi, Molly. How are you?
Good. So, why are data centers and the growth of artificial intelligence such a big issue for electric co-ops right now?
So, for the last 15, 20 years, there's been stagnant, maybe even negative growth in electricity consumption for most utilities, including cooperatives. And now they're seeing these forecasts for incredibly large growth, 5, 10% over the next 10 to 15 years. And a lot of that is coming from large loads. And it's not just AI, it's cloud computing, streaming, anything internet related, podcasts. And it's a different type of customer than co-ops have seen. Some of these large customers, they want huge amounts of power in really short timelines. And some of these, the size, just the magnitude of their requests could double or even triple the co-op's peak electricity use over the next 3 to 5 years. So it's a really big deal. And some of it is AI. They're starting to build out the hyperscalers, the large campuses are building out for the AI, and that is very energy intensive. So that's why it's a big deal for co-ops, and especially since co-ops historically have had more residential customers, a higher percentage, and now these huge C&I, commercial industrial loads are coming into their territories. And so that's what's really changed over the last few years.
Is this a trend affecting just certain parts of the country, or is it pretty spread out?
So there are certain pockets that are seeing a lot more growth than others. Northern Virginia is the largest, most saturated data center market in the world by a lot, actually. And we have several members in Virginia where it's sort of spreading out. The data centers were originally focused on urban areas, maybe suburban areas where there was existing infrastructure. They're now moving out to the rural areas of Virginia, further south. Some of the other markets they're going into now are South Carolina, Georgia. Texas is seeing a lot of activity. We're even seeing it in the Midwest. I've been to some conferences where they were not co-op focused. They were maybe financial conferences. And they were saying, oh, we don't think we're going to see it in the middle of nowhere. Well, we are seeing it in the middle of nowhere. We're seeing it in places like Eastern Oregon, where there's really not much. And all these data centers started coming in the 2010s. And now their communities are just exploding with growth. So it's going around the country.
And in working with co-ops on this issue, what are some of their common concerns? Obviously, it's a huge increase in demand. What kinds of concerns are they bringing up with you on serving this load?
So first off, they're just concerned with the amount of inquiries they're getting. And some of these inquiries are not very serious. They're just kicking the tires. Maybe they're going to multiple utilities. So that's taking up staff resources. And so they have to sort of learn how to weed out some of the tire kickers. But then also, once they do get into the negotiations, their primary concern is their existing members. They want to make sure that they're not stranded assets. They want to make sure that there's not upward pressure on rates for their existing members and other community concerns that existing members might have, like noise, traffic, things like that. So those are the big things.
NRECA recently put together a report on rates and cost recovery mechanisms for co-ops that may serve these large loads, data centers and whatnot. What are some of the key takeaways from that report?
So I think one of the biggest things is to fully understand the risks. There are some opportunities, but there are risks, to make sure that the board is educated and to make sure that there's a high level of communication and collaboration between the distribution co-op, their G&T or whatever wholesale supplier is, and then obviously the customer. I think that they're having to communicate and collaborate on a level that they have not had to before, because they need to really make sure that they're mitigating, managing risks, and that they're not impacting other customers, and that they're not risking any of their financial stability. So I think that's one of the big things.
What mechanisms, whether it's contributing to infrastructure that's needed to deal with these large loads or cost recovery clauses, what are the most effective ways to balance the opportunities of data centers while protecting members from stranded or increased costs?
So I think, along the lines of the last question, that report discussed a lot of the upfront payments, requiring deposits, letters of credits, paying for engineering studies and things like that, and making sure that the data center is paying their own way so that it doesn't impact other rates. And if rates are designed properly, one class of customers, CNI customers, should not impact residential customers if they're designed properly and if the data center is paying for their fixed costs.
So obviously, co-ops need to be careful of the risks, and you outline some of the ways they can do that. But as our report stated, data center projects and agreements can be made to benefit co-ops and existing members. Tell us about what those benefits could be and how they can be achieved.
So, yeah, there are benefits. Growth is good. It comes with some risks, but there's also some great benefits. Increased tax revenue, increased jobs in the community, direct jobs, maybe construction and technical, but also indirect jobs, including services, restaurants and stores and things like that. So, those are some of the benefits. And if the co op is open to it and has discussions, they want to make sure that the community knows what's going on. It's actually more the data center's job to make sure that the community is aware of the plans, the construction plans, and things like that. But I think the co op wants to stay involved, make sure that they're educating the existing members. There's lots of concern about upward pressure on rates because, in theory, if there's more kilowatt hour sales spread across more fixed costs, that could reduce upward pressure on rates and maybe in some cases lower rates. So there are lots of benefits.
Could these large customers and the revenue they bring in potentially enable co-ops to make certain upgrades in their system they wouldn't otherwise be able to that could benefit their other members? Talk a little bit about that.
Sure, possibly. If the data center comes in and they're upgrading some of the distribution and transmission system, that could benefit other customers. Also, broadband, if they come in and they sort of bolster the broadband system in the area, that could benefit a lot of the members in the community.
So you touched on the communication issue and mentioned how the data centers have a responsibility to explain to the communities what these large loads are and what the impacts could be. What can co-ops do to help make their members understand and help them know what they're doing to serve these loads without having impacts that might be negative?
I think just being open for discussion, making sure that their employees, their board members, everybody's educated. It's not necessarily their responsibility to hold community meetings, but it might be something they want to talk about when they have their annual meeting. And they might just want to just make sure that if people call in, if people have questions, they're there. And the data center would be responsible for hosting a meeting specifically about the data center, but they might want to partner with the data center and make sure they're available at those types of meetings.
Great. And you also mentioned collaborating with boards and how co-ops can work with different partners to kind of educate themselves, make informed decisions. Talk a little bit about that collaboration, sort of the process for a co-op who's maybe been approached by a large load and now is trying to decide how best to serve them.
Yeah, I think the first thing they would want to do is get their internal teams together and figure out, can we serve this large customer? How serious are they? But then they would really want to make sure that they got their board involved, depending on how regularly they have board meetings, and make sure that they look at their bylaws and their internal processes and how they handle things with their board. It's going to be different from board to board. And sometimes they're going to be regulated by a public service commission, although not always. And so that adds another wrinkle in things, another step. But I think the boards are interested. They're looking to be educated on this type of thing. It's a great opportunity, but they really need to make sure that they also understand the risks.
And what more can co-ops do to take advantage of this expansion in data centers while still protecting reliability and affordability?
I think just, being open for business, being skeptical and doing their homework is really important. Anecdotally, I've heard, and I don't have any data on this, that the data centers like to work with co ops. They're transparent, they're accessible. You can't pick up the phone and get the CEO of PG&E online, but you can call the CEO of a co op and I'll call you right back. They can work with their leadership. I think they enjoy working with the co op. So that is a good thing. There's some co ops that are going to be skeptical and say, we can't do this. That's too much for us to build. We can't do that. And that's, they have to consider how they might have those conversations as well.
Great. And looking just at NRECA, how are we helping our members kind of handle this growing demand from data centers? I know we've obviously put together some really smart reports, but what are we doing to kind of help them evaluate these opportunities and look at potentially helping serve data centers?
So in early 2025, our senior leadership decided to initiate an enterprise-wide initiative focusing on the data centers and the large loads. And it's not just data centers. There's also manufacturing and industrial processes and larger transportation electrification. So we're also working on that. I've actually been looking at the whole data center issue for a few years. Even if you go way back to 2018, I was looking at the cryptocurrency mining because we had members that came to us about that. But we have launched a landing page on cooperative.com. There are several new resources there, as well as some of the ones I worked on in previous years. We have hosted webinars. I'm going to be moderating panels at several conferences this year, CEO Close Up, Next, Power Exchange, and we're just continuing to develop resources and add them to the landing page. And we really want to hear from members about what they want to see, what's important to them, because we don't want to work on things that are useless to them. So we'll be continuing to work on this and evolving, and our message will be evolving as things change in the industry.
Great, Allison. So some great resources for our members. And yeah, just a really big issue for co-ops that's presenting some risks, but also could have a lot of big opportunities. Allison, thanks so much for joining us today.
All right. Thanks, Molly.
Let's pause here for a word from our sponsor. And when we come back, we'll talk to two co-op leaders on how they're handling the surge in data center development.
Broadband deployment doesn't have to be complicated. Simplify the process with AFL's suite of Apex splice closures. With a compact, high-density design, the Apex closure line is built for speed, space efficiency, and long-term reliability. When combined with AFL's wrapping tube cable featuring spiderweb ribbon technology, Apex delivers a smarter way to meet today's broadband demands, helping service providers stay compliant, confident, and ahead of the curve.
I'm Autumn McMahon from Oklahoma Electric Cooperative in Norman, Oklahoma. You're listening to Along Those Lines.
Welcome back. Next, we'll hear from Wabash Valley Power Alliance CEO Jeff Conrad and AECC's JD Lowery on their approach to data centers. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff and JD.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks for having me.
So to kick things off, let's talk about the interest you've received from data centers in recent years. This is obviously a huge source of demand growth for utilities. Just talk generally about the volume of inquiries you've received and the types of capacity these customers may be looking for. Let's start with you, Jeff.
It's exciting times right now because we have definitely seen a lot of interest for us. Probably over the past year, we've had over 140 leads on potential projects or interest that's been expressed. Probably half of that is larger loads that are data center type loads. So it's certainly keeping our economic development team very busy. And for us, we have secured one large load in particular, a data center. We are under an NDA, so it hasn't been publicly announced at this point in time. But I can say that it's very significant. To give you a sense of kind of a goal that we had this year as we were preparing, knowing that there was so much interest in our area. Collectively, last year, our system peak at Wabash Valley, we were about 1,800 megawatts. And it was obvious that we were going to have some interest here. And I put a goal out for our team to get ready for 1,000 megawatts of new load, which is over 50%, obviously an increase from where we're at just last year over time. So it was good that we put that goal out because we're going to have a lot more to serve here in the near future.
Great. And how about you, JD? What is the outlook in Arkansas and in your service territory?
Yeah, and I'll echo everything Jeff said. I mean, last spring, we really saw a dramatic jump in the interest from data centers. There for a few months, we were getting 10 requests a week, anywhere from 50 megawatts to 1 gigawatt. At one point last year, we had 4,000 megawatts in requests. And to put that in perspective, we're currently a 3,000 megawatt generation and transmission co op, largest load being around 250 megawatts. So it's certainly been exciting. It's been a challenge. As of last spring, traditional manufacturing prospects would come to us with an exact power need with possible expansion. So we kind of knew the targets we were shooting at. Now we've got these data centers who are asking for a tremendous amount of power in short periods of time. And we'll take a minimum, but we'll take whatever you can give us. So it's been interesting times for us to plan for those and to meet some of the demands that they're looking for. Currently, we're pretty far along with two particular projects, around 750 megawatts in total. But, I probably still average about two initial conversations with new prospects each week.
And what kinds of investments might be necessary to meet this kind of demand? Are we talking about just procuring a bit more energy? Is it something where you need entire new power plants constructed? Can you kind of speak to the work you need to do to accommodate these customers?
Sure. So these are tremendous loads and which we call power intensive users. And we have some capacity that we can work with them on. However, with some of these, they are larger than some of the power generation assets that we're currently constructing. So for some of those, that's going to require new generation to be built. That's going to be a significant cost. In some regards, transmission is also going to be an increased cost to accommodate these new potential data centers that are looking to locate in Arkansas. So we're working with them on a variety of ways to try to make that happen, do it in a way that limits the potential rate increases on our existing members. And so far, we are making some headway with some of the prospects that we are dealing with.
And a similar question for Wabash Valley. Jeff, what kinds of steps do you need to take when you're looking at serving these loads? Is it, again, something where it's procuring more energy? Is it building new infrastructure? What are the demands of meeting this data center demand?
Sure. That's a good question. And we do have a separate tariff for large loads, and it's something that we've had in place for quite a few years. So that helped us give us a little bit of a head start. And what we do from a power supply standpoint with any large loads, we essentially customize a portfolio for these large loads, meaning we'll find out the resources based on their load that they need and put a portfolio together. And it could be a mix of either some purchase power agreements, it could be owned generation, it could be purchase power from the market from an energy standpoint or a mix thereof. And so that's what we kind of do from the power supply standpoint. And we set it up such that all those related costs are borne by the new load and doesn't spill over into the existing membership. So that's what we're looking for from a power supply standpoint. Depending on the location, transmission, certainly the infrastructure and the distribution, that could be a pretty big piece of the equation that we have to work through as well. Every project seems to be just a little bit different, particularly on that piece of it.
And what are the challenges of doing that? Obviously, if it requires building new infrastructure, that's an investment in time and money. What are the kind of unique challenges in serving data centers versus a more traditional customer?
Just being in the power business, there's risk, right? And then for us, when you look at data centers and to this scale, the risk is probably just a little bit more magnified. Probably some of the things that come to mind for us, one is stranded costs. We want to make sure, and certainly we'll make sure we protect the other members because if you put in this infrastructure or make some obligations, whether it's on the power supply or transmission side and the distribution side, and if the project doesn't materialize and you've already made that investment, That could be problematic. On the flip side, if maybe the project still comes in, but you're expecting it to be something, and it ends up being half of what they originally told you to be. And so again, you might have some potential stranded costs. So a lot of our discussion starts with that when we look at these potential loads and how we would need to take measures to make sure we protect ourselves from that. The other thing we have to think through is even when we feel like we're doing a good job of making sure we get the right protections in for the membership, there could always be a change of law or regulation that could influence the protections of the contracts that you have in place. So you kind of have to think through that. And so that's something where we've had to spend a lot of time making sure that we've addressed those potential risks as well.
And JD, how about you? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Jeff said it very well. I would just add that we deal with our state economic development group and other stakeholders throughout the state, and a lot of them don't understand why we don't just go out and build all this generation to serve all these unlimited data centers that are out there with this seemingly endless demand. I think the risk is that there could be a bubble. Obviously, all the projections NRECA has done studies on this, and there's numerous ones out there. It says that data centers are going to drive growth exponentially over the next 20 years, 10, 15, 30 years. And it does seem endless, but we don't know that for sure. There could be some technological advances that make these data centers more efficient. And so, to Jeff's point, they may not utilize all the capacity that they say they are, which we have seen in traditional economic development projects. So, one of the challenges that we have is to mitigate that risk going forward. And we do so in a way that protects our current members, our distribution co-ops, and us as a generation and transmission cooperative.
And could you guys elaborate a little bit more on what some of those protections are? I know in some instances you can have them cover upfront study costs, infrastructure investments. What are some of the key ways co-ops can limit that risk when agreeing to serve these facilities?
Well, there's a variety of ways. The easiest way is to work with them and ask them to cover those upfront costs, whether it's a study, whether it's through deposits, whether it's paying for transmission and or generation assets. Almost every prospect that I speak to talks about how much money that they have to bring to the table that can help with those types of costs. Some of the conversations don't end with that. It doesn't always materialize like they might say it does, but we are working with some of our groups to be creative in that regard to utilize that. And most of the serious inquiries understand that and understand why we're doing it and are good with it. And so, to that extent, that is what we're doing to help to limit that. And Jeff kind of mentioned this earlier. I mean, we have some other tariffs that we're offering that don't require building of new generation assets. We have a demand response tariff that opened up 1,000 megawatts that are interruptible, that will allow them to be interrupted for economic or other reasons. And so that allows us to serve those prospects immediately without having to build new generation. So as long as they're willing to be interrupted for periods of time.
And we know that data center demand can be somewhat steady, somewhat of a flat load profile. How does that affect your planning when you look to maybe serve a data center? I mean, it's different maybe than some other types of load that goes up and down during the day. Like, how does that change how you decide to serve these customers?
Yeah, again, we try to customize a power supply portfolio. So we'll look at the load that we're getting. And to your point, the loads here typically have a really, really good load factor. And if we step back probably 5 or 6 years ago, take out the word data center and describe the load that we're talking about today, that would be something that every co-op was dreaming about, is to get a load with a great load factor and great credit, and you want to be part of the community. And so for us, in serving that, we'll customize our portfolio to kind of match what they need from a load standpoint. So that's probably how we kind of think about it.
And JD, any thoughts on that as well, or similar to what Jeff said?
Similar to that, obviously it makes capacity planning more predictable, better asset utilization through that load factor. A lot of the distribution co-ops would love to have loads like this. I think something to keep in mind is not all data centers are the same. Most of them do have a steady load factor, but AI is kind of a wild card. You've got two types of data centers, training and inference. The inference data centers are like the traditional cloud-based or data-driven ones, content management. But the other is responding to queries submitted by AI and training, and that can have large swings in demand and have a much lower load factor. One thing I would also point out that kind of doesn't complicate it, but is something that has to go into consideration is that they require large amounts of reliability, which will increase upfront costs of initial service and through redundant feeders, transformers, and all that. So that's something else that, has to come into consideration for planning as we move forward with these projects.
And do you find that these potential data center customers or actual data center customers, are they pretty open to your approach? I mean, do they understand that this requires taking these extra steps, or how are they to work with?
Now, especially now, they have been pretty understanding of this. Initially, last year when we started getting contacted by data centers, they wanted huge amounts of power. They wanted it in 6 months, and they wanted it to all be powered by renewable generation. And so when we would give them our answers that we could do some of those things, but maybe not by the timelines that they would like, they kind of backed off a little bit. As they've gone around the country and talked to other utilities, they're starting to get the same response to a certain extent. And so they've become much more understanding and flexible in what it takes to get them up and running. Renewable generation is still important to them, but it's less of an upfront need. They just are looking for pockets of power where they can get online as quickly as possible. And so, with that being said, they're very much understanding of our situation and willing to work, whereas a year ago they weren't. And I'd say this: most of these data center groups have very savvy employees in terms of the electricity business, and they're very well in tune, many of whom previously worked for an electric provider. So they know what they're talking about coming into the conversation, and they know what you're telling them. And so it's been a very workable situation as of late.
Great. And we've discussed some of the unique challenges and needs to serving these facilities. Let's talk about the benefits, both to the co op and their members. Are there benefits that come from the work to serve data centers, and maybe discuss those a little bit?
I think it's very, very important to kind of think through that. And there's probably some obvious benefits. Obviously, with these data centers, there's a lot of investment that they make at the local community, just with the facilities that they put in place themselves. It's billions of dollars. So you got property tax revenue that's going to be good for the local governments. You have a job creation during the construction phase, a lot of job creation. But then there's some technical type roles on a long-term basis. And then I think also they're going to be good citizens or partners with the community. From all the discussions we've had and meetings, and you really get a strong sense that they want to make sure that's the case. And then for us, one point that we try to focus on, because these loads we have 21 members that we serve as a G&T, and they could show up in any one of our 21 members. But as we do one of these loads, we want to make sure it creates benefits for all our members. So that's something that we were looking at to make sure it does help us such that we can have some long-term rate stability. That's important to our members. And so we feel like that's a piece of this that is really, really a key piece of making this successful for the G&T and all its members. So that's another kind of a direct benefit or immediate benefit that we focus on.
And JD, what about AECC? What do you, in your opinion, see as the potential benefits of data center customers?
It sounds like Jeff and I sit in the same type of meetings. It's like he could have just been in one of the meetings we had last week, and we had the same conversations and approach to all this. I'd say, obviously a benefit to a local cooperative, especially in rural parts of the state that are, dependent on irrigation wells. A load like this, it could be a game changer for them in terms of revenue. I think the overall benefit to rural communities that we serve is, while Jeff did mention jobs, and some of these do have more jobs than you would anticipate, they're not as much as some of the traditional economic development projects that I've worked on in the past. And so that workforce has been a huge driver for why rural communities get cut from projects. And so because there's less numbers needed, and going back to the workforce need, it's whether it's due to the skill set or just the pure numbers of people in those areas, they tend to get cut from some of these larger projects. So we have these communities that are getting looked at that might not normally be in the running. So as long as the data center can acquire land at a reasonable price and secure the electricity that meets their needs, these rural communities get to participate in the boom. And it's may not have the economic impact from a job perspective, while it's certainly there. It certainly is a benefit from the local tax revenue generated by these facilities that can be a great benefit to the communities. And they do make significant investments, Jeff mentioned, and those are beneficial as well.
Have you had consumer members reach out and just ask, what do these data centers mean? What are the impacts? And if so, how do you communicate on this issue with your consumer members?
Like I said, we have not had a data center land just yet in co-op territory. We've had one or two in the state. However, people are seeing the news. There's a lot more talk about it throughout our communities, throughout the state. So they're aware that they are looking at Arkansas due to a variety of factors. There's concerns a lot of them have about whether it's noise or the utilization of water resources, potentially driving up electricity rates, those types of things. So we've had a handful of people reach out to that. We honestly haven't had a large scale communications plan on this just yet because it just hasn't gotten to that point. We've had some articles in our statewide magazine about it. Our CEO has brought it up. And so, however, though, if they start landing like we think they might, then, we will create a kind of a communications plan around that. But right now it's really person to person, phone calls, emails as they come in, and just having conversations with folks in the communities. And the distribution co-ops we serve are certainly having those same conversations.
And Jeff, what's your tactic there?
Similar to what JD is saying, we're addressing questions as we get them, but it's our preference to be proactive as much as possible when it comes to communication. And in a lot of the communities are kind of have a negative connotation right now. We've seen 2 or 3 counties within the state of Indiana where they've essentially kind of shut down potential loads that were going to come in that would have been pretty significant. Some of those were in our members' territory, some of them outside our members' territory. So to that point, one thing we have done as a team here is go and meet with county commissioners to sit down and just lay out the facts. We don't go in with a set agenda or anything, but we go in just to say, if it's done correctly, I really believe there's some value to be created for the community. And so we talk through things that we would do as far as to make sure we get the proper protection and how that value could come through. And so it's something we continue to work on, but we got more work to do there.
And on the topic of policies, what kind of policies or regulatory actions at the federal, state, local level could help co-ops and other utilities work to serve these facilities? Are there things you think your government or regulator should do that would support you, or what's your thoughts on that?
For us, change of law or rules or regulations is one of our biggest concerns. And so just trying to have consistency is something that we're looking for at the state and federal level in particular. Knowing that the rules or laws are set up a certain way, let's, try not to change that. And then that's difficult because we're making usually 10, 20, 30-year type decisions. And we know things will change over time. So we do what we can to protect ourselves in the agreement. But just having something we can count on would kind of go a long way. And so, as long as we know how things are going to be legislated, we're kind of good to go. I will say, we are located as far as our headquarters in Indiana, but we have 3 members. We serve in Illinois. They have legislation over there where they have a strong push toward clean energy type resources. And it's a little bit different than the state of Indiana. So that causes us some challenges, but we've worked through it so far. But yeah, just consistency would be nice.
And JD, what are your thoughts on that?
On the federal and state level, it'd be great, and echoing stability that Jeff said, but, if we could help find a way to keep baseload generation facilities from closing prematurely, at least operate through the anticipated lifetime that was paid for by ratepayers, I think that would be really helpful. Here in Arkansas, we're losing 2 coal-fired facilities in 2028, 2030. And that's about 3,500 megawatts of generation being lost, not just to co-ops, but for all the generation partners in the state, being lost at a time when more power is being demanded than any other time in history. And those plants have a useful life through 2045, but they're going to be shut down 15 to 17 years early. It does seem like the current administration is trying to kind of help out there with several executive orders to help facilities in rural areas like these by providing funding for costs that are associated with upgrades necessary from an environmental standpoint. I think we've yet to see exactly how that's going to play out and what that's going to look like. So I think that would be tremendous and would at least give us some breathing room because these data centers, while there's certainly an interest in renewable energy and we certainly are an advocate of utilizing any resource that makes sense, they're really suited for baseload generation and that's their need. On the state level, our legislature has been pretty proactive. They passed legislation this year through Act 373 that lets utilities and cooperatives recover costs of building new power facilities and other transmission upgraded infrastructure. It allows them to finance it during the construction rather than when the project is completed. This helps avoid big rate shocks once a project finishes. And there's some other facets of that legislation that's helpful to us because we're still waiting to see if that is a feature the co-ops would utilize, but we'll see as we move forward with these projects. I would also say one of the biggest hangups for us in a lot of utilities is the supply chain issues that we're finding for transmission equipment. Anything that could help incentivize the development of workforce and supply chain for switch gears, for breakers, for all these things to be made domestically could help significantly reduce lead times that it would take to get some of these projects up and going.
Any other closing points you want to make, JD and Jeff, about things co-op should do, concerns you have, anything that we haven't discussed today?
I would just say, one of the things that we've done, because I mentioned the volume of requests that we've had over the last 2 years, is we've created a power intensive user process, created tariffs related to it, anything 50 megawatts or higher. We found that our transmission and generation planning folks and everybody involved in this process were spending a tremendous amount of time providing answers to projects that weren't serious. And we created this threshold. They have to pay a deposit and it's part of that process, and we've outlined it on our website and made it available for them. That way, it kind of helps us determine the serious projects from the not so serious projects because there's so many stakeholders that are inquiring about these types of projects. And that's really helped us focus in on what we need to be doing and making sure everybody's using their time as efficiently as possible.
I would just echo what JD said there as well. As we've kind of dealt with these potential new loads, we've had a process that's evolved over time and where, again, it's more structured and it does require them to make an upfront payment before we start incurring some costs on studies and things of that nature. So that's been something that's been good. Probably the other thing I would add is just, and I haven't talked about yet, is just communication with your board and your membership. This is exciting, transformative type times that we're going through right now as an industry and certainly as co-ops and utilities. And so for us, try to take advantage of, we have monthly board meetings and we usually have agenda items where we're providing updates on how we're progressing on with some of our discussions. We do a weekly video and we had a kind of a weekly series there for a few weeks where we took one of the topics related to these mega loads and talked about each one of those specifically. And then another thing we do is we do what we call a deep dive where we try to come in the night before a board meeting and in a more casual environment where they're maybe having dinner or dessert, and we have just an open dialogue discussion to kind of get into some of these issues where, like I said, a little bit more relaxed setting, so that it seems like that's been a good situation where we get some good discussion, good questions, and it's something that is incredibly important because, like I said, we're doing some different things here. And you want to make sure you're in lockstep with the board. And I can't say enough about our board and the appreciation I have for them and the support that they're showing and the leadership as we step through some new places here for us.
Gosh, yeah, we could talk about all the ways co-ops are working to serve these data centers. I think we could have an hour-long podcast. But JD and Jeff, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts today and really some good perspectives, both on the challenges and the opportunities of serving data centers and other large loads. Thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to you, our listeners, and our sponsor, AFL. For more on this and other podcasts, visit us at electric.coop. Until next time, for Along Those Lines, I'm Molly Christian.
I'm Claudia Raffet from Sussex Rural Electric Cooperative in Sussex, New Jersey. Thanks for listening to Along Those Lines. Subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app.